Abdullah, and welcome to Inside America. Kurdish leaders say they have no plans to secede from Iraq, but in practice, their steps suggest otherwise. Over the past few years, they have taken increasingly bold steps to boost the position of their autonomous region in an otherwise war-torn country. The most significant of which has been the multi-billion-dollar oil and gas deals Kurdistan has signed with Turkey and foreign oil companies in defiance of Baghdad and Washington. Already, Kurdistan seems to have most of the preconditions of an independent state. It has its own foreign ministry, it manages its own army, it flies its own flag, and has a Kurdish national anthem. But to achieve de-jure independence or legal status in the United Nations, Kurds need something else: the support of powerful nations such as the United States. The US has historically been opposed to an independent Kurdistan, but in an increasingly tumultuous Middle East, where traditional borders and politics are challenged by a resurgence of ethno-sectarianism and religious extremism, isn't an independent pro-Western Kurdish state in the US interest in that strategic part of the world? Well, to discuss this subject, I am joined by Marina Ottaway, a scholar at Wilson Center for Independent Research, Douglas A. Olivant, a senior national security fellow with the New America Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. Marina, let me start off with you. The Kurds have fought for independence for decades, but they couldn't get it through wars, through through liberation struggles. But now they seem to be getting it through oil.
They're getting de facto independence. The Kurdish region, or Kurdistan, is autonomous for all practical purposes. The press always refers to it as the semi-autonomous region. There is nothing semi-autonomous, it is autonomous. But as you pointed out, it's very different from having de jure independence and be recognized in an independence country. And I don't think that at this point, the Kurdish leadership believes that it is in the interest of Kurdistan to move to try to achieve de jure independence, because this would create too many problems with Turkey, with the United States, with a lot of other countries that would hesitate in recognizing a fully independent Kurdistan.
Douglas, don't you think that financial independence from Baghdad is getting the Kurds a step closer towards statehood?
It could, but I want to echo what Marina says. It's in the KRG's interest to maintain its de facto independence without taking these full legal steps. If all the Kurds in the region were in the northern three provinces, if there were no Kurds in Syria, none in Turkey, none in Iran, then this would be a much easier problem set. But given that all the other neighbors of the KRG also have significant Kurdish minorities of their own, which are in territory adjacent to the KRG, this then becomes a much larger international problem and a step of formal independence.
So you're saying the neighboring countries are the biggest obstacle for a Kurdish state?
Absolutely. It's not so much that the Kurds need the support of an outside power like the United States or Russia, although that never hurts, but it's the neighbors. You have to have a friendly neighbor, given that any map that you would draw of even a greater Kurdistan is still going to be landlocked. You have to have a neighbor through which you can get.
Do you agree that our biggest problem is the neighbors?
Well, it's the neighbors, but it's also the United States to some extent. You said that it would be in the interest of the United States to have a stable, independent Kurdish state. The United States sees it otherwise. In other words, what the US worries about is that if Kurdistan was to secede, then that would be the beginning of the disintegration of a lot of states in the region.
But why wouldn't the disintegration of the Middle East, which was basically formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire by the British and the French and some other powers, why wouldn't that be in the interest of the United States?
Well, because you don't know what's going to come next. And the United States is not ready to take the chance of what would come next. If you had division, we don't know that what would come after the present states would be smaller, stable states. It could also be chaos. That is where the United States is not willing to take it.
So are you saying the United States is worried about the unknown?
Yes.
About the future?
Very much so in this case. It worries about greater chaos. The United States has always been very hesitant in recognizing the independence of new countries. It was true, for example, when Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia. it was true. It was not totally happy even about the collapse of the Soviet Union originally, because because of the unknown there. In Yugoslavia, essentially, is the nightmare of what could happen when a country divides. It's not always an amicable.
But doesn't that make us also think, or make the Kurds hope, that once they declare independence, the United States will come to terms with it?
It might. It might. In the end, I think countries tend to accept the inevitable. But I don't think the Kurdish leadership, I tend to take their statements at face value. I just had a lot of interviews with Kurdish leaders in Erbil recently, and what I heard from everybody is the dream of an independent Kurdistan is in all our hearts and in the hearts of every Kurd. But now it is not the time. And I think they mean it, that now it's not
Douglas,
the time.
do you think an independent Kurdistan will be in the interest of the United States in a region where, as I said in the setup piece, you have Al-Qaeda rising in Syria, you have the borders of the Middle East being challenged, if not redrawn, by the resurgence of these ethno-sectarian groups like the Kurds, the Shias? Wouldn't that be in the interest of the United States to have a secular pro-Western ally in that region?
You can certainly craft a narrative in which that's the case. But again, to echo Marina, we don't know where this is going to end. You can see a scenario in which this all works out peaceably. You can also see a scenario in which this, say, throws Turkey into chaos for 5, 10, 20 years. That's certainly not in the interest of the United States. And the United States is fundamentally a status quo power. It likes things the way things are. It likes countries to be stable, even if they're not perfect, even if they're not just. It prefers stability to the unknown.
But didn't that change after 9/11?
No, I don't think so. I think maybe temporarily, maybe for a brief moment, but I think certainly the United States is chastened by what happened by its invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq.
But the rise of the Kurds in Iraq and in the region is definitely a result of the invasion of Iraq.
Absolutely. That action certainly ended up very well for the Kurds. And I think that's why the Kurds are not going to take any bold moves. They have a very good deal in the KRG. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than anything the Kurds have had in historical memory. So why mess with a good thing? If you've got your revenue, if you have de facto independence, why take the step when all you would really get for it is formal passports and a seat at the United Nations? What do they really get by declaring independence in return for all the risk that comes along with it?
I put it slightly different. It's not, I substantially agreed, but I would say the question is not what they would really get if they got their own passport and a seat at the United Nations. I would put it differently. I say, what do they lose by waiting a little longer until the situation is clear?
But what that a little mean? The Kurdish people could say that
they
they waited for 100 years.
One thing it means waiting until they are sure that the revenue stream that they get from exporting oil and gas directly is sufficient to make up for what they will not get any longer.
That's expected to happen by 2015.
Well, it depends on the price of oil at the time, but it's supposed to happen fairly soon. The question is, even then, are they willing, for example, to provoke Turkey, which is in the middle of a complicated negotiation with its own Kurdish population? Turkey, interestingly, looks at Kurdistan as an example, as help in solving the Kurdish problem at home. You know very well that President Barzani was with Prime Minister Erdogan in Diyarbakir very recently. They held a joint meeting there that was very well received by the Kurdish population there. I think the Turks would see it as a provocation at this point if Kurdistan was to declare full independence.
The Turks have definitely seen the prospect of a Kurdish independent state as some sort of nightmare that might also lead to the emergence of another state in southeast Turkey. So if Turkey comes to, gives green light to an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and if this is unlikely at the moment, but let's say because it's going to be increasingly dependent on natural gas and oil, and Kurdistan region has abundant oil and gas reserves. Will the United States follow Turkish example and recognize a Kurdish state? It seems to be the main worry for the United States is Turkey. If Turkey agrees with it, then the United States may just go ahead.
Maybe, but I don't think so. I think there are so many other equities at stake. Certainly, Iraq itself, but also Syria. Also, given our new détente with Iran, all these interests would be taken into consideration. So I think it's easy to see a scenario in which Turkey and the KRG. Well, it's not easy to see a situation in which the Turkey and the KRG come to terms. But if we accept that, I think it's easy to see the United States still not getting on board.
Okay, let's say they're not going to recognize it. That's what. If we decide based on the moment. But what are they going to do to prevent the emergence of a Kurdish state if Kurdish leaders went ahead and declared independence?
I don't think they'll do anything in practice. I don't think because they certainly are not going to invade Kurdistan to force it to stay part. I mean, that's not even conceivable as a scenario. So that I think in the end they will not extend the diplomatic recognition, but I doubt that they will take concrete steps. I doubt that they will impose sanctions against an independent Kurdistan and so on. But if we can go back about why the United States does not want an independent Kurdistan, what does an independent Kurdistan mean? Where does it stop? Because there is the issue of a greater Kurdistan, which I don't think it's in the table now, but there is the much more likely issue of a proliferation of little Kurdish entities.
With the emergence of the recent autonomous zone
With
in Syria.
the region of Rojava, or and there is no way in which Rojava is going to be part of Kurdistan, or the Iraqi Kurdistan, anytime in the near future, because of the political differences between them. So that, in fact, what probably would happen if Kurdistan declares full independence is the proliferation of small Kurdish entities, which may not be in the interest of Kurdistan either.
What do you make of that? Do you think that the United States is primarily worried about the emergence of other autonomous zones in other countries? That's why
I don't know if that's at the top of the list, but it's part of this unknown, all these unknown unknowns, the possible emergence of chaos, and the possibility that you have this statelet that declares independence and then finds itself embargoed by all its neighbors. What happens if the KRG declares independence and Iraq and Turkey say, well, that's fine, but you're not flying any flights through our territory? How do you get to Erbil then? How do you get in? How do you get flights in? Or if the Turks then say, well, fine, we'll just take all our oil through the one pipeline that comes from Baghdad, and we don't need our oil from Kurdistan. We'll just double our imports from Iraq. There are all kinds of foreign policy tools that could be, because it's going to be a landlocked country, under the best of scenarios, you have to have a neighbor.
Douglas, for a long time, the Kurds made a moral argument that because Saddam Hussein had carried out the genocide against them, they kind of follow the Jewish example, and they said, we don't want that repeat again. We don't want another Holocaust happen again against us. Chemical gas was used by Saddam Hussein. Do you think that would be a powerful argument in the United Nations to achieve the support of European nations or other Western powers?
I do not. I do not. Simply because there's been regime change in Baghdad, because now you have, Baghdad is run by people who are similarly victims of Saddam's tyranny in different ways, perhaps more subtle, less overt. It's a different regime in Baghdad, and I think to make the claim that somehow the current government of Iraq is going to use chemical weapons, or it could in any scenario try to repeat massacre the Kurds.
My question was more about the past, whether the past will justify the ends, the future.
I don't think that that moral argument is going to carry the day. In the end, what carries the day is the way in which different countries see their own interest. And the United States at this point, for better or for worse, I'm not necessarily saying the United States is right, but there is no doubt that the United States does not see it as in its own interest to see the proliferation, to see the Iraq falling apart, to see the collapse of the Iraqi state, which they consider to be the autonomy
But Marina, why not? In the rest of Iraq, Iran is the most influential player. not only economically, where it has it has the lion's share of investment, but also politically. No government has been formed in Baghdad ever since the invasion without the approval or some sort of tacit consent from Iran, from Tehran. Like, why would the United States care about an Iraq like that to disintegrate?
Because they still consider one united Iraq to be more stable than what could happen if Iraq disintegrated. Again, I'm not necessarily saying the United States is right, but that is certainly the thinking in Washington at this point. And I think it's important for the Kurds to understand that this is the thinking in Washington, that it would take an enormous change on the part of the United States to accept the independence of Kurdistan.
So another question that the Kurdish people often raise is that they want like a soft partition of Iraq. That's what Joe Biden suggested when he was a senator. But Joe Biden has never, after he became vice president of the United States, he never talked about that. Why do you think he never talked about that? Is it because, what is the reason you think?
I think because the situation in Iraq was different. You know, in the midst of the civil war in 2006, when it appeared that Iraq was splitting naturally anyway, that was his suggestion to somehow make Iraq come to terms. I think now the United States is more hopeful, despite the current al-Qaeda offensive against Baghdad, that Iraq holds together. Certainly much more than it was. It certainly continues to look better than it did in 2006.
And the Kurdish leaders often seem to find the Republicans more in alliance with them than the Democrats. It's because in 1991, George H.W. Bush provided a no-fly zone for them, and then in 2001 with the invasion of Iraq. Do you think there's a difference between the Democrats and Republicans when it comes to this separatist movement around the world?
No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think the Bush administration wanted an independent Kurdistan any more than the Obama administration wants an independent Kurdistan. I participated in a lot of the meetings of the so-called expert groups that were set up to help the State Department formulate the policy after the invasion, right? The United States Institute of Peace set up all these groups. And the first statement that came in all those meetings was, well, what is the interest of the United States in Iraq? And the first answer that everybody was unanimous was to keep the unity of Iraq. That is a policy that was there at the time of the G.W. Bush, and it's there now.
But Marina, I remember most of the events that happened after the invasion in 2003. If you look at the policy that the United States implemented, you see most of the policies were encouraging disintegration of Iraq. The first one was demolishing the army. And then you had the de-Baathification that marginalized the Sunnis and increased the rift between the Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds.
There were stupid policies. There were mistakes that the United States made. Those were not decisions taken in order to force the disintegration of Iraq.
That's absolutely correct. Do not mistake. And if the Kurds read American blundering in the early part of the Iraq War as a deliberate attempt to somehow make the independence of Kurdistan more likely, they are fundamentally misreading what happened.
But they did make an independent Kurdistan more likely with those, as you said, blundering, with those mistakes they made in Iraq.
All right, but don't mistake that for intent.
They are unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's very different from saying that was the policy. Go back to the Constitution if you want to say, if you want to see, discuss more this issue of unity. The United States, despite the fact that it played a major role in the writing of the 2005 Constitution, was very unhappy with the degree of autonomy that Kurdistan got and the limited power of the central government. it was not the constitution that the United States would have wanted. And from the beginning, there was a process that was set in place. And it's a committee that never produced its report, and everybody has forgotten that it was created to revise the constitution, to try and to make it more centralized. The United States did not like that constitution, and there was a feeling that somehow the Kurds had outmaneuvered everybody.
Marina, as like a scholar, you've written a lot about democracy, about federalism, and I've read some of your really scholarly great articles about Iraq from the invasion until now. Don't you see that as really a contradiction when the United States support a centralized government for Iraq, while it has a very decentralized and supports a very small government back home in the United States?
There are a lot of Americans who would argue that the federal government is not very small, but that's
but nobody likes big governments here. I'm sure about that.
Not in theory. No, but I think the United States, first of all, the United States wanted a federal system for Iraq. But it wanted the federal system like the American federal system, where every states are organized along geographical lines and not along ethnic lines, and where all states have the same degree of power. What the United States did not like was this Kurdish region that had what the United States thought was an excessive amount of autonomy. Now, I am putting on my analyst hat. I'm not advocating anything here. But if you want to, objectively, the United States was not happy about that constitution.
Isn't it, like as an American, Douglas, isn't it better for like a state like New York or a district like Washington to have its own affairs managed at the local level rather than all being decided by the federal government? That's what the Kurdish people want in Iraq.
There are no states in the Union that have their own armies, that let people come in without a U.S. visa. There's no analog in the United States to what the KRG does. And I think if you want to look for a U.S. analog, you should look at what the United States did when part of its territory tried to secede and how it reacted to that.
So you think Iraq's federalism is really not a federalism? It's like way more than...
It's certainly not federalism on the American model. I mean, there are lots of models of federalism.
Well, first of all, it is what people call an asymmetrical federalism. Because in a real federal system, you have a federal government, and then each state or region or province has its own government. What you have in the case of Iraq is a government that governs all of Iraq in a fairly centralized fashion, except for Kurdistan. And that's what the asymmetrical federalism is.
I remember in one of your articles, I think in 2005, you said that the Shias voted for the Shias. You noted that the Kurds voted for the Kurds and the Sunnis voted for the Sunnis. That was true. And that suggested that all of these, and you said, quote unquote, I think, these groups have different agendas and goals in Iraq.
Yep.
So doesn't that suggest a decentralized kind of system is the best for Iraq?
Yeah, but there are many, decentralization can be carried out in many different ways. Decentralization does not mean necessarily regions with the degree of autonomy that Kurdistan has. Look, in the end, it is up to the Iraqis to choose. It's not up to the United States to choose. And so far, there was talk, for example, after 2005, of the possibility of the formation, Al-Hakim was advocating it, the formation of a Shia region that would comprise all the Shia provinces with a degree of autonomy similar to that of Kurdistan. That was rejected in the end. That solution was rejected. It's beginning to reappear a bit in terms of individual provinces that are beginning to be turned into regions with greater autonomy. But so far, it's not the dominant
Right
threat.
now, on that note, I would like to take a short break, but after the break, we will come back to discuss the subject further. While Turkey has drastically improved its relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, it continues to oppose autonomy for its own 15 million Kurds. Why does Turkey view Iraqi Kurds separately from Turkish Kurds? Has it lost the fear that an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq will encourage similar moves in Turkey? Stay with us to know more on that subject after the break. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. For this segment of the discussion, we're joined by Ben Van Huvelen, Managing Director of Iraq Oil Report and a contributor to the Washington Post. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Ben, I recently read your really remarkable article in the Washington Post in which you linked the oil to the prospect of a Kurdish independent state. Can you tell me about that? Do you think oil will eventually get the Kurds independence?
I'm not sure that we can say with certainty that oil will bring independence. I think that what we can say for sure is that oil is giving the Kurdistan regional government much more geopolitical power, much more leverage in its negotiations with Baghdad. So I think there are many, many factors that are going to shape how things go for the KRG. Whether that leads to independence or just greater levels of self-determination.
And how will that influence, say, United States' position on the politics of Iraq in general and also on the prospect of a Kurdish state? Do you think the United States would be more supportive of the Kurds because of that?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. The broad answer is that the U.S. is very interested in making sure that Iraq stays one unified country. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's a more complicated question, though, because, of course, you also have American oil companies who are working both in southern Iraq and in Kurdistan. And so the equation becomes a little bit more muddied in that way. So the U.S. policy officially at this point is to discourage Kurdistan from becoming independent. But within the context of a unified Iraq, there are a lot of different levels of autonomy that we could see for the KRG.
Yeah, Ben, as a journalist, you've worked in Iraq for quite a while, and you've covered the oil industry in Kurdistan and Iraq as well. Why don't you just give us some basics about the amount of oil that Kurdistan regional government has? I know the Kurdish government claims certain numbers, and why is Turkey, why has Turkey turned to be such a partner with the Kurds? Is it just because of the oil and gas? Do we have so much oil that Turkey will need?
Yeah, sure. The oil resources in Kurdistan are actually relatively small compared to those in Basra and other parts of southern Iraq. Part of that is because there hasn't been very much exploration in Kurdistan so far. So as there's more exploration, the reserves levels will probably go up. At this point, they're relatively small. In terms of what is Turkey's interest in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan, the real answer is that they're primarily interested in natural gas. Again, it's a relatively unexplored province in terms of natural gas, but the early results have been very, very promising. Turkey, as you probably know, has this economy that's growing very, very quickly. Their energy demand is going up quite rapidly. They're going to almost need 50% more natural gas in the next 10 years. And right now, with the deal that they've outlined with the Kurdistan government, they could be getting roughly half, if not more, of what they're going to need in terms of incremental new supply through their energy deal with Kurdistan.
Ben, I'll return to you for more on that subject, but now I would like to bring in Marina into the discussion. Marina, Ben drew a difference between the interest of the private sector, U.S. private sector, and that of the public sector in Kurdistan or in Iraq. ExxonMobil, not Total is French, sorry, Chevron, they are doing investment in Kurdistan, while the U.S. government has been opposed to the oil deals that KRG has unilaterally signed with those companies and with Turkey.
Well, yes, and this is not the first time that oil companies have their own policy, if you want, and they operate in countries where the United States, with which the United States, countries the U.S. does not recognize or with which it does not have diplomatic relations and so on. Oil companies had, for example, their own policy towards Angola at a time when the United States did not recognize Angola. So there is nothing unusual about the oil companies going their own way. But the oil companies, what they want is to be able to sign the contracts, export the oil, get their money back. They don't care whether Kurdistan is independent or not.
But they do care about the risks involved there, because risks and business are,
They clearly have decided that the risk or that the potential returns to their investment in Kurdistan is sufficient to take the risks that are involved. but they are not necessarily supporters of independence for Kurdistan.
The fact that Exxon has entered into, like, I think a 15-year oil contract with the Kurdistan region, doesn't that mean ExxonMobil sees Kurdistan stability as long-term?
I don't think so. I mean, the saying is oil companies see geology, not geography. You know, they see the oil in the ground. They'll usually go drill for it. The political risk then is something they usually think they can work their way through in the long term. So I think we need to be careful about reading too much into this. The fact that ExxonMobil is in the north means they think there's oil in the north, and that's all it means. It doesn't mean they're a fan of an independent Kurdistan. It doesn't mean they're against an independent Kurdistan. It doesn't mean that they've necessarily taken a side in the Baghdad-Erbil dispute, although kind of de facto they have, but they'd rather not. So don't read too much into what Exxon has done. They're not trying to make a political statement. They're just trying to get more oil reserves on their books.
Whether we like it or not, they indirectly boost the position of Iraqi Kurds as a political entity, as a non-state actor that plays an enormous role in international relations of the Middle East.
Again, if the Kurds think that Exxon's on their side, I think they're misreading the situation. Exxon does not have a side in this. They just want to pull the oil out of the ground.
Then why do you think ExxonMobil and other major oil companies have risked their oil contracts in Baghdad and entered deals with the Kurdistan regional government? I think they were initially blacklisted by the Iraqi government. I'm not sure if they are blacklisted. Maybe you can update us on that.
I think there are a couple of answers to that question. One is that when the oil companies, especially Exxon to begin with, looked at their assets in southern Iraq, I think they saw that they weren't getting quite as good a deal as they had hoped they were going to get, and that the terms that they were looking to get in terms of future deals with Baghdad weren't improving. So they didn't think that they were risking all that much in terms of what they could lose out on if they were to anger Baghdad. The other side of it is that when they evaluate new opportunities, they really look at three things. They look at the economic aspect of a deal, they look at the geological aspect of the deal, and they look at the political risk. And when Exxon, I think, first took a look at Kurdistan, they said, well, this is a very, very attractive geology. We think that if we drill, there's going to be oil coming out. They looked at the terms that were being offered by the Ministry of Natural Resources and said, we think that this is fair, that we can get a good profit margin on this. And then they looked at the political risk and they said, I think, we aren't sure how this is going to work out, but this is a long-term play, and we can imagine several scenarios over the next 5, 10, 15 years where we're going to be able to drill for oil and sell it on world markets.
Ben, I'm aware that there is a difference between the kind of contracts that, the kind of oil contracts that the Baghdad government signs with foreign companies and those contracts that the KRG does with Turkey and other foreign companies. The KRG contracts are called production sharing agreements. Can you tell me the difference in concrete terms? What is the difference between the Baghdad contracts and the KRG contracts?
Well, in the simplest terms, the difference is that with a technical service contract, which is what Baghdad is offering, oil companies pump oil and they receive a fee for each barrel of oil that they produce. They also get all of their costs covered by the government. In Kurdistan, with their production sharing contracts, the oil companies actually get a share of the production. So anytime they sell oil, some of the proceeds from that oil goes directly to the company. And it's also subjected to taxes and all sorts of other financial mechanisms. But basically what a production sharing contract does is it makes sure that you're tying the financial interests of the oil company to the financial interests of the government.
So production sharing contract that the KRG has are definitely better, and that brings me back to your point that you made. The reason that ExxonMobil and other companies have gone into deals with the KRG is purely economic.
Yes,
right?
Yes. They're getting good deals.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Ben, I'm trying to bring Marina now into the discussion. Sorry, Marina, do you think so? It's purely economic, and the Kurdistan regional government should not, how can I say, should not depend on those companies and risk declaring independence anytime soon?
It should not assume that those companies are supporters of Kurdish independence. they clearly have, are betting that the contracts that the Kurdish government has signed with them will hold, although Baghdad says that they are not legal. But in a sense, what they really care about is the contracts, the revenue that they will make from those contracts. And they want to be in Kurdistan because, as Ben said, although the proven reserves so far are not all that large, exploration continues, and there are indications that the reserves will be very large at the end of the day.
So, Ben, I would like to come back to you for one more question. The contract, there has been a dispute between Baghdad and Kurdistan whether the Kurdistan's oil contracts are legal or illegal. Baghdad has centrally said all of them, virtually all of them, are illegal. Kurdistan says they are constitutional or they are legal. What is your observation? What is your viewpoint about that? And what do you, like, who is right and who's wrong?
Well, I can't say who's right and who's wrong about that. What I will say is that Iraq as a state is incomplete in its construction. Ideally what you would have is, if there were a dispute between two competing authorities in a state over what's legal and what's illegal, you would have a judicial branch that would then go ahead and make a ruling on that legality. Unfortunately, the judicial branch in Iraq is incompletely formed and is not an authority that carries weight or very much weight with the Kurdistan region. So I think it's less important what my opinion is about who's right and who's wrong. The observation that I would make is that the question of legality is not being decided by an Iraqi body like the Iraqi judicial branch. The question is being decided by foreign companies, i.e. who is willing to sign contracts with Kurdistan or with Baghdad. And it's also being decided by actors like the Turkish government, which is making decisions about whether or not to facilitate the export of oil from Kurdistan.
I think we need to take another short break right now, but after the break we will come back to discuss this subject further. But one of the challenges facing any future Kurdish state would be the historic land disputes Kurdistan has had with Baghdad for many, many years. Those disputes center around the oil-rich province of Kirkuk. Will Kurdistan be willing to give up Kirkuk for independence? After a short commercial break, we will return to discuss this subject in more detail. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. Douglas, I would like to come back to you and ask you a question about the disputed territories we have with Baghdad. And those lands are unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. As an American expert who's viewed Iraq, who's been to Iraq, what do you think about those disputed territories and whether you think the Kurds should choose independence and give up Kirkuk if they had the option to go for independence?
Well, it's certainly not my place to tell the Kurds what they should or should not do. Now, if they wanted a dissolving of ties with Baghdad to be more peaceful, certainly leaving this disputed territories behind would be a big step towards ensuring that this was a more velvet split than the hostile one. But as we've been emphasizing all along, I think there are just so many things that that are unknown, that will develop over time. And I think that's why the Kurdish leaders are being prudent about this. We need 10 or 15 years for this to develop. We need to see what the real oil resources are. We need to have a census, finally, around Kirkuk and get a real sense. I think it's been 30, 40 years, and we know there's been a lot of demographic movement. So we have no idea what the real truth is about what the demographic splits are in these disputed areas. So we need to get that data. We need to learn what that really is, and that will drive, what the status is. Obviously, it's different if Kirkuk is 60% Kurdish or if it's 60% Arab. Those are two entirely different scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked that question is because if you give up Kirkuk, Baghdad may not have a problem with you breaking up from Iraq. Do you think that is true?
We've heard whispers of this from Baghdad, that if the northern three were just to go, maybe on the green line as it's currently drawn, maybe that would be okay. But no one's saying that officially. No one's talking about that. So that's really an unknown right now.
I mean, at the moment, Baghdad has virtually no control over over the Kurdistan region, the 3 provinces.
No.
Do you agree that if Kurdistan gave up Kirkuk, it could convince Baghdad to recognize an independent region in Northern Iraq?
I have no idea, frankly. I really cannot answer that question.
Based on your observation over the past, few years, isn't that going to be better for the Shia, say, to let the Kurds go their own way?
I don't know, because the central government, the Maliki government, for the time being, still embraces a very centralized concept of the Iraqi state in its all border. We don't know what's going to happen with these elections. We don't know how this tendency that is growing in Iraq of many provinces demanding to become regions is going to affect the thinking of Baghdad. So I really don't know how to answer your question.
Ben, I'd like to return to you with this question. Over the past few years, ever since Turkey has signed more and more contracts with the Kurdistan region, the United States has been opposed to those contracts. But recently, we've seen less opposition from the U.S. government to the relationship between Turkey and the United States, Turkey and the Kurdistan region. And that's what I heard from Deputy Minister of Energy. What I read, he told one of the recent reports here in Washington. Do you agree with me?
I think that I agree with you in part. The U.S. government has never firmly said that they are against Kurdistan signing oil contracts. When companies have come to ask them for advice, the U.S. government has told them, we see a lot of political risk there, and be careful. They have stopped short of fully endorsing the autonomous Kurdistan oil sector.
Jen Psaki, the spokesperson for the State Department, has repeatedly said it here in Washington that the United States will not support any oil contract that does not have the approval of Baghdad.
They've said that about exports. Yes, they've said that they don't export, that they don't support independent Kurdistan exports.
Yeah. So you don't think there has been a shift in U.S. foreign policy recently regarding the rapprochement between Turkey and Kurdistan?
I think maybe there's been a shift in tone. I don't think there's been a shift in policy quite so much. The policy, as it's been restated again recently, as you said, was the State Department has said, we do not support independent exports. However, what you've heard also recently is that U.S. officials have come out and said, we do support new oil coming onto the market. We really would support an agreement between Baghdad, Ankara, and Erbil that would allow a lot more KRG oil to flow. So I think maybe what you're seeing is the U.S. government coming around to the fact that these exports are imminent and really wanting to shape the situation such that the exports happen in a way that feels least threatening to Baghdad.
Ben, in the first segment of the program, we were discussing whether the United States will support an independent Kurdistan should the Kurds declare independence, say, tomorrow. What do you make of that? I mean, the United States has been an ally of the Kurds ever since 1991 at least. Do you think they will recognize Kurdistan in the United Nations?
I think it's too early to say. I think that any question like that will really depend entirely on the circumstances that produced any kind of declaration of independence. I also think that such a declaration is probably a ways away, so there are far too many unknowns to be able to say. What I can say with certainty right now is that the messages from the U.S. government to the Kurdistan government is that the U.S. government does not want to see an independent Kurdistan. The U.S. government is very interested in maintaining the territorial integrity of Iraq, and I think that a big subtext in this issue, which we haven't quite discussed yet, is the issue of precedent, that if the Kurdistan region gains more and more autonomy and even becomes independent, then that sets a precedent that other provinces in Iraq might be inclined to follow, such as Basra. If there were a serious independence movement in Basra echoing the autonomy movement in Kurdistan, that would be immensely destabilizing for southern Iraq, and that I think the U.S. government would see as a threat to its interests.
And Marina, while Kurdistan is becoming increasingly financially independent from Baghdad, it's becoming financially dependent on Turkey. Which one is better?
Well, it's, Kurdistan does not have many options. I mean, there are only two ways it can export its oil, either through through Iraq, and in which case it remains financially dependent on Iraq, or through Turkey, through a separate deal with Turkey, in which case it's dependent on Turkey. I think the difference is that Turkey needs Kurdish oil, in particularly gas, very badly.
And Baghdad doesn't need that.
And Baghdad does not need it. So it's more likely to, it's less likely to take steps against.
So are you saying we can have more influence on Turkey than Baghdad?
If you don't declare your independence. I think if Kurdistan was to declare independence, that might change the relationship with Turkey. And that's why I don't think the KRG is going to declare independence anytime soon. What is going to influence the position Turkey takes in the long run is where it stands in its dealing with the Kurdish population domestically. Because if it manages to settle the issue domestically, if it manages to come to terms with the demands of the domestic Kurdish population, then it would not feel as threatened by the possibility of an independent Kurdistan as it does now. But these are all question marks at this point.
Right. Nor have we talked about what a possible, the restoration of Iran in the international community might mean, and if Turkey can get oil from that direction. All these things change the political calculus.
We actually just 1 minute left. I'd like to return to Ben. Ben, do you think Turkey has kind of lost the fear that it once had about the influence that a Kurdish state in northern Iraq might have on its own Kurds? Turkey has always been worried that an independent state in northern Iraq would encourage similar tendencies in southeast Turkey.
I think that there's been a real change in Prime Minister Erdogan's thinking about this. I think there are a couple of things that have happened. The first one, and I think probably the most important, is that Erdogan's political situation has evolved and shifted in Turkey. So he's really trying to build a base of political support based on sort of a cultural and religious approach to which he believes a lot of Kurds in Turkey will be sympathetic. So as he thinks about how to create a working majority to fuel his future ambitions politically, I think he sees Turkey's Kurds, or at least a chunk of Turkey's Kurds, as potential allies. The other piece of it, I think, has very little to do with his concern for southeastern Turkey, and it has to do with his recognition that in order to keep Turkey's economic growth going, they're really going to need to have quite a lot of cheap energy coming in. And so if he can create a energy alliance with the Kurdistan government, and if President Barzani can become a good ally of his to help bring Turkey's Kurds on board, or at least make Erdogan look like a friend of the Kurds, then I think that that's a bonus for him.
A great note to end the discussion. Ben Van Huvelen, Managing Director for Iraq Oil Report. Thank you so much for talking to Rudao from New York. Marina Ottaway, a Senior Fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for talking to us as well. Douglas Olivant, a Senior National Fellow with the New America Foundation. Thank you so much for talking to us as well. Dear viewers, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, be well.